Is there another microphone up here?
I haven't bounced it though. This one.
Hello, does that work?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to the seminar series. I'm going to introduce Kyle. Kyle Rodman is a research scientist at the Ecological Restoration Institute here at NAU. He grew up in the Southwest and became interested in the natural world through early experiences skiing, camping, backpacking, and helping his grandparents maintain their ranch in central Colorado. Kyle spent several years in the environmental nonprofit sector before completing an MS in forest science at NAU, a PhD in geography at the University of Colorado, and a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, before returning to the ERI last year. Kyle's research focuses on forest ecology, climate change impacts, and forest management issues in the Western United States. So thanks for being here.
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear you talk.
Yeah, thank you, Erin, so much for the introduction, and thank you all for attending in person, all over the country via Zoom. This is really exciting for me to be a part of the seminar series. I was, as Erin mentioned, I was a student here years ago, and I think I've attended probably dozens of these seminar presentations at one time or another, and was always really impressed with the things that people were thinking about and working on. So, you know, hopefully I live up to that today and am able to kind of chip in and contribute something useful to this really cool program that School of Forestry has here. So kind of expanding on that, NAU has a really special place in my heart. Anna and I have wanted to get back to Flagstaff for the past 5 years, really since we left. We wanted to get back here and have been hopping around a bit since then, but yeah, really exciting to be back in Flagstaff, be working on forests in the Southwest again on topics related to management, forest ecology here in this kind of arid climate sensitive system that we're all part of. So today I'm going to be talking about some stuff that I've done over the past few years or so, since leaving Flagstaff and coming back to NAU. We're folks getting that feedback? Maybe we should turn that down a little bit, huh? Turn this one off. So, is that better? Sound okay in the back? Cool. Yeah, so one of the things that I really appreciated about being here at NAU, I had pretty much no scientific experience before I started the master's in the School of Forestry. I can say without a doubt that work with several people in the department here and School of Forestry, the Ecological Restoration Institute, made me a scientist, right? And kind of set me up for where I am today. So again, really, really cool to be back here and working again at School of Forestry and at Ecological Restoration Institute. So my current role, I've been a research scientist at the Ecological Restoration Institute for about 6 months now. But what I'm going to be talking about today, as I mentioned, is the stuff that I've kind of focused on in the previous years. So as Erin mentioned, I've been hopping around a bit in the last few years, as tends to happen in the academic track. You know, you're moving around from place to place a lot. And in the last few years, I did a PhD in geography at CU. A lot of that was focused on wildfire and post-fire recovery processes in the Southern Rockies. After that, I kind of pivoted a little bit, and I was doing some work on bark beetles and post-bark beetle recovery trajectories in Madison, but again, that was focused on Southern Rockies systems. So that's largely what I'm talking about today, is these kind of projects that are in different systems in the same geographic region, disturbance and recovery, and how those things kind of interplay. But before I get started, I really want to acknowledge the large group of people that have made the last few years really special. I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of really amazing folks in the field, in the lab, as collaborators, as mentors, that have made these projects possible and also a lot of fun. So again, just really want to acknowledge these folks in particular, but there are lots of people that I just didn't have space on one slide for. So again, been a fun few years. And in particular, I want to acknowledge Sarah Hart right here, who was my postdoc supervisor for the last couple of years, as well as Tom Veblen right here, who was my PhD supervisor at CU. So when we think about the broad scale factors that influence the distribution of forests throughout the world, there are really two things that come to mind for me anyway. At a really broad scale, climate is a key driver of the distribution of forests, right? Forests have sort of a narrow window of temperature and moisture conditions that they can thrive in, right? And at a global scale, we see forests tend to occur in these places that are fairly wet, fairly warm, but there's some variability there, right? We also see that disturbance plays a key role in the distribution of forests on a global scale. This figure, which was in a paper by Bond and others in 2005, shows this pretty well, I think, where they were using dynamic global vegetation models to predict the distribution of Earth's forests based solely on climate and then climate plus fire. And what we see here is that at this broad scale, when we're thinking about just climate, forests cover a pretty substantial portion of the globe, right? There's a lot of places that are climatically suitable for the distribution of forests. When we add fire to the mix, we see a lot of these places actually show a decline. And this is because of places that are sort of marginally suitable for forests, but are seasonally dry and burn often, right? Maybe like on the order of twice a year, even in the case of some C4 grasslands in Africa. And so in these kinds of systems, these are places where, you know, forests could potentially grow, but they just can't get a foothold because things are burning so often. And what we've seen in the last 100 years or so, based on the instrumental record, is that climate has warmed by at least 1 degree Celsius on the surface of the Earth, right? When we think about these broad scale factors that control the distribution of forests, climate and disturbance, these warming temperatures are likely to play a key role in shifts in the extent of the forest biome, as well as the behavior of disturbances. So this figure probably looks familiar to some folks. This is from the CMIP-5 projections from a few years back from the International Panel for Climate Change. And what you can see here is that we've had, as I mentioned, a bit of an increase in temperature over the past century and a wide variation of potential trajectories in the next century based on assumptions about human population trends, carbon emissions, policy changes. But these are really kind of the best case and worst case scenarios, anywhere between like 1 to 4 degrees of warming, potentially more than that. But this is kind of the average across multiple GCMs with these different emission scenarios. Just based on this 1 degree increase, we've already seen some changes, right? So this is a good example of direct effects of climate on forest demographics in the Western US. I think Pete was actually part of this paper. But this was by Van Mankin and others looking at a bunch of permanent plots all over the Western US. And they were able to actually show that background mortality rates, not due to fire, bark beetle outbreaks, those sorts of things, just kind of background mortality going on in forests in a given year, have increased pretty substantially over the past 50 years or so. And in large part, this is due to warming climate. We also know that climate can have different effects on mature individuals and juveniles of a species, which is kind of an interesting aspect to this. And it leads to what we sort of refer to as system inertia or resilience debt. Like there are a lot of different terms that we use to describe this concept. But what we see in general is that mature trees, once they establish, can survive for long periods of time and they can tolerate a wide range of climate conditions. Juveniles are much more sensitive to climate. So what we think about here is disturbance can actually be a driver of these non-linear changes in forest cover by affecting mature trees and altering the environment experienced by juveniles. So what we expect here is that warming temperatures would eventually influence existing species distributions and the extent of forests. It might take decades or centuries because these trees tend to be pretty long-lived and they can persist through a lot of different conditions. But if we see increases in disturbance that remove that forest overstory and require regeneration to recover those forests, we might have pretty different dynamics, right? We might have these really rapid changes and losses in forest cover. And as most folks know, we've also seen an increase in disturbance activity across much of the Western US and other parts of the globe. Again, linked to warming temperatures, increasing aridity. So these are two that I pulled out here because these are the dominant natural disturbances in Western North America. On the left, we have fire activity across a range of ecosystem types, but we've seen an increase in annual area burned since the mid-80s, and we have really good data on these things. This was a paper by Higuera and Bassaglu last year, and they were focusing mostly on the 2020 fire season, but they were trying to put that in a historical context, right, and link it to kind of these broad-scale climate drivers. And what they showed in this paper is that summer vapor pressure deficit, which is a proxy for temperature and relative humidity, it has to do with aridity of the atmosphere, is one of the strongest predictors of annual area burned across the Western US. And 2020 happens to be one of the warmest, driest years we had on record. Similarly, bark beetle outbreaks, which span a huge portion of the forested area of the Western US, have been strongly linked to climate. And there's a couple different mechanisms there. One is that when you have warm winter temperatures, that allows bark beetles to reproduce more effectively. They can survive better over the winter, so greater fecundity overall, and that leads to initiation and spread of outbreaks. This is a map put together by Hickey and others in forest ecology and management a couple years ago. And this is showing cumulative mortality since the late 90s. A lot of these outbreaks happened in the mid-2000s, right after a period of extreme drought. Is the feedback still rough back there? It's okay. So today I'm going to be talking about the Southern Rocky Mountains. And so the Southern Rockies are defined here with this gray polygon. This is an area I have a lot of familiarity with, and I have a lot of love for because, as Aaron mentioned in the introduction, I grew up in Colorado. I spent a lot of time in the mountains in Colorado, in the forests in Colorado, as well as northern New Mexico, southern Wyoming. My family, got around and camped a lot. So this was a place that I have a lot of familiarity with and I care a lot about. So it's been a natural fit for me to do a lot of research in this region. And when I talk about this region, this is defined here with this polygon. This is one of the EPA level 3 ecoregions. If folks are familiar with that program. Essentially, it's splitting the country up into these fairly homogeneous areas in terms of climate, topography, and vegetation types. And there's different levels of these, but this is kind of like a broad scale way of defining the ecoregion. Within this area, there's about 145,000 square kilometers. Of that area, it's roughly 55% forested. But as you can see here, it ranges about 1,500 to 4,400 meters in elevation. And that variability means that we have a lot of variation in terms of forest types, forest dynamics, and disturbance regimes. This will be something that folks in Flagstaff are probably familiar with, sea heart Merriam's like zones, which were partly developed here in the Flagstaff area on the San Francisco peaks. And I'm going to kind of use this as a way of guiding us through the vegetation of the Southern Rockies, which is fairly similar to what we have in the Southwest, but I think there are some important differences as well. So we'll kind of talk about that in a minute. The lowest elevation sort of forest woodland system that we have in the Southern Rockies is pinyon juniper, similar to the Southwest. Slightly different species of juniper, same species of pinyon. But again, these tend to be kind of the warm, dry edge of forests. There we go. Of forests in the Southern Rockies. They also tend to exist mostly in the southern half of that region and the western half of that region. So when you get up to like northern Colorado, we don't see much of this. Moving up, we get into the montane forests, and these are a combination of Ponderosa pine and mixed conifer primarily. So I'm kind of lumping these two together for the sake of the presentation, but obviously there's a lot of variability across low ponderosa pine to dry mixed conifer, wet mixed conifer. And finally, kind of the highest forested elevations, we have sub-alpine forests. So these would be similar to the high forests on the peaks, for example. One key difference is that we have a lot of lodgepole pine in the northern half of the study area. Folks will probably be familiar with some of the work by Monica Turner and others. Lodgepole pine is a species that can do really well after fire. It's rottenness, at least partially. But that's not present throughout the whole region. So just kind of keep that in mind. So today I'm kind of focusing on these two different zones and two disturbance types that have been pretty widespread in those particular zones in the region over the past 30 years or so. So in the montane, we've had some bark beetle outbreaks, but they've been pretty sort of scattered and minor, right? Like in montane forests of the Southern Rockies, bark beetles are killing trees at sort of an endemic level and not really widespread. Fire has been pretty widespread in the montane zone, particularly in the last 10 years or so, as I'll show here in a minute. In contrast to subalpine, up until 2020, it had very little fire activity in our study region, but it's been really heavily affected by bark beetles. So I'll talk about these two disturbances and these two zones and kind of hone in on some details. But in both cases, when we talk about the disturbances inherent to these two different zones, forest persistence is largely governed by the severity of initial disturbance, as well as the way that the forests recover following disturbance. So related to this point, the things I'm going to be talking about today are these questions of how have bark beetle and wildfire affected forests of the Southern Rockies and what's happening next? What do we expect to see in 10, 20, 50 years down the road? So this first section is about a couple of projects that we've worked on in wildfire and montane forests. And when we talk about severity of a fire, as many folks here know, it's often infeasible to go to every point on the landscape and survey how many trees have survived and how many have died in the fire, which is really what severity is, right? It's the amount of forest that died in an event in one place. What we often do instead is we use imagery, satellite imagery or aerial imagery before and after the fire to quantify tree survival in different parts of the landscape. So that's what this map is showing. This is from a paper led by Jim Stevens. That was a synthesis of post-fire landscape management in the Southwest. This is for the Waldo Canyon fire, which happened near Colorado Springs. And what you can see is in this fire in particular, there's a lot of variability. Right? There's some places that were affected at high severity, some places that trees seem to be relatively unaffected, right? Pretty much full survival. And that's pretty typical of a lot of fire events, actually, that we see pretty variable effects across a perimeter of a fire. What we care the most about, though, is these places that have been affected at high severity where the forest has been entirely removed by the fire. So that's what this analysis is showing right here. We were using imagery from before and after every fire perimeter in that study area to quantify high severity fire area by year. So when we plot that all out, we see a pretty steady increase over time in the amount of high severity fire area in this region. And the clear outlier right here is 2020. Folks have probably read about the 2020 fire year near Fort Collins, Rocky Mountain National Park, and all that stuff. That had almost 3 times as much fire area as the second year, which was 2002. So we're seeing these sort of rapid nonlinear increases, and we have these extreme drought years, we get substantially more high severity fire area. And I'll add that this is not really unique to the Southern Rockies. There have been studies that looked at broader scales and were able to quantify sort of similar trends. Megan Singleton and Andy Thode have done similar work in the Southwest. Sean Parks and others have done some work in kind of a broader west-wide sense, right? This is happening in the Southern Rockies, but it's also happening in other areas. And when we think about forest's ability to recover from these high severity fire events, in the montane zone, we're talking about these two species primarily. Ponderosa Pine and Douglas Fir, which are probably familiar to a lot of people in here, right? And listening online. These are two common species in the montane zone in Southern Rockies. They're also common in Ponderosa Pine mixed conifer systems here. When we think about their ability to recover from fire, it's really a combination of three things. Seed has to be available, the microsite has to be suitable for germination and establishment, and climate has to be suitable for germination and longer-term survival of those individuals. Unlike lodgepole pine, which I mentioned previously as being serotinous and able to regenerate from closed cones after fire, these species require live seed trees and dispersal from unburned or low severity burned areas to colonize after high severity events. What makes these things really interesting, for me at least, to study is the fact that all these factors can actually vary in space and time, right? So that's kind of what we're looking at here, and what a lot of these analyses are focused on is how these different constraining factors vary throughout space and time. So a couple things that we did related to post-fire recovery and the spatial and temporal variability of seed. If folks are familiar with Miranda Redmond's work, she's worked a lot in pinyon Juniper systems. She's been a good collaborator of mine for the last few years. She has kind of pioneered this method of reconstructing cone production in pine species. So we use this with Ponderosa Pine to look at temporal variability in seed production at the tree level. And it's a pretty cool technique. It's kind of like going and doing world counts on a seedling, right? You can date annual growth to the year. And on each year, there are these characteristic little places at scission scars where the cone detaches from the tree in a given year. And those provide evidence back 15, 20 years for these slower growing pine species of past cone production. So we did a bunch of these surveys throughout a bunch of different fires in New Mexico and Colorado, and we were able to reconstruct the years that we had good cone production post-fire. We also used high resolution aerial photography to identify the locations of surviving trees. So this is like an image classification where we told the computer what trees looked like and what open areas looked like, let it do its magic, and the end result is something like this, where we identify the locations of surviving trees. Thinking about the key findings here. So what we see in general is kind of interesting. So, we weren't really sure what to expect in terms of the temporal variability in cone production. Could be that some of these places are being limited and not recovering well because there just hasn't been much seed production after a given fire event. But that wasn't the case. What we actually saw is that in every single fire that we looked at, there were good years and bad years for past cone production. But by and large, there were at least a couple really good seed years across all these fires. What seemed to be more limiting was this right here, the locations of surviving trees and dispersal from live trees, right? So where you have live trees, seeds being produced, it's just not necessarily getting to where it needs to go all the time. We were also thinking about spatial and temporal variability in climate. So we know that climate affects juveniles more than adult trees, as I mentioned earlier. We were using destructive samples of juveniles across several fires to look at the kinds of years that things were establishing. And this is a technique that Monica Rother and Tom Veblen have kind of used a lot in recent years, looking at the establishment of trees after fire. Essentially, you go out and you dig up a seedling, and you take cross sections of that seedling at different heights, and you can figure out the oldest part of the tree as the place where the roots and the shoot come together. So in doing that, we figured out the annual establishment dates for about 700 individuals of a few different species. We also developed these maps of spatial variability in climate conditions or growing conditions that might affect establishment post-fire. And the combination of this, what we found is that within about 10 years of fire is that window where both species tend to come in best. Within that 10-year window, these abnormally wet, cool years were the best for establishment. We also found that these places that are generally cooler, wetter, so higher elevations, north-facing slopes, tended to be best for establishment of these two species after fire. When we project that forward, what we see is that generally establishment after fire is expected to become harder for these two species across much of the study area that we looked at. So these are two different emission scenarios. Folks might recognize RCP stands for Representative Concentration Pathway. RCP 4.5 is kind of a moderate emission scenario where we're assuming that people can get a handle on emissions by about 2040 and human population doesn't increase too extremely from next century. RCP 8.5 is a much more kind of dire scenario. It's about the worst we could expect. Thinking about several degrees of warming, huge increases in human population, that sort of stuff. So what this is showing here on the left is for Ponderosa Pine in the recent period, 1981 to 2010. Different parts of the study area are likely to recover more easily. So you can think of this as being higher numbers mean better recovery on average, but it's really like the number of years in a 30-year period we would expect to see good recovery. So we see here again, there's spatial variability, right? These higher elevation systems seem to be a little bit better for the recovery of these two species versus lower elevation areas tend to have a lot harder time. But then we also see a decline in the future, particularly under RCP 8.5. So for both of these species, it's roughly 5% of the study area that can be expected to recover well in the late 21st century under extreme emissions. So a good reason for us to start thinking about curbing emissions. Right, just one of these examples of many, many things that could be affected pretty severely. So I'm also going to be talking about bark beetles and sub-alpine systems. So I don't know how familiar folks in this room are with bark beetles. I know it's a huge topic of study in the Southwest. What you all have seen in Southwest and Arizona and New Mexico has largely been its outbreaks and pinyon pine. What we've seen in the Southern Rockies is really a combination of three beetles that are fairly widespread across much of the Western US. The first one is mountain pine beetle, and this primarily colonizes lodgepole pine. It does affect other species of pines as well, but to a lesser extent. And in particular, in our study area, this is the species that's been most affected. We also have spruce beetle, which folks that have driven over Wolf Creek Pass through Durango have probably seen pretty extensive spruce beetle outbreaks. Those are kind of the hot spot for us. And then western balsam bark beetle, which is one that folks may be a little bit less familiar with, but it's still fairly widespread. It tends to attack sub-alpine fir or corkbark fir. One thing to note about western balsam bark beetle, though, is on average, it tends to affect stands at a lower severity. It tends to persist for several years at a time, but it only kills about 5% of the trees in a stand in a given year. And then it eventually makes its way somewhere else. So altogether, these three species are actually responsible for over 70% of the tree mortality due to bark beetles in the Western US. So that's kind of what we focused on. And one, they're locally important, but two, they're kind of broadly important westwide. One final note about all three of these, they tend to preferentially attack larger trees, right? So it's kind of unlike what you would see with a fire, like if you burn a prescribed fire through a stand, it's tending to thin out a lot of the smaller stuff, the sort of thinner barked species. Bark beetles affect things in a very different way where they sort of affect things top down, right? And they are host specific, right? So if you have a bark beetle outbreak of mountain pine beetle, for example, in a mixed species stand, we can expect that the lodgepole pine would be heavily affected and the other species less so, right? This photo on the bottom left here was by my collaborator, Teresa, and this was taken up near Grand Lake, Colorado, after a mountain pine beetle outbreak in like 2004. So you can see this area pretty severe mortality, but what's interesting is that you can really see the size selective effect pretty well. A lot of the surviving trees in the foreground, at least, are those smaller ones, right, by and large. One of the ways that we've quantified the area affected by bark beetle outbreaks over the past 20 years or so is using aerial detection surveys. So these are a program conducted by the US Forest Service, where they go out with fixed wing aircraft and they have tablets And they go and fly over forests and they circle areas or circle stands and estimate the amount of tree mortality in that stand and try to attribute it to an agent. So a bark beetle or a foliator or something like that, right? These are really useful in a lot of ways. People can be pretty good at picking out different causal agents. They can be pretty good at estimating the amount of mortality in a broader area. But what becomes more difficult is to try to estimate the amount of tree mortality in a really small area, right? If you're circling a stand and you can say like 20% of the stand is affected by bark beetles, that's useful. But if you can hone in on a particular part of the stand and say 50% of the trees in this corner of the stand were affected by mountain pine beetle, that's much more precise. That tells us a lot more information that we can use in a management sense, right? So that was kind of what we were trying to do here. We were trying to map the percent mortality due to bark beetles across this study area using Landsat data. So similar kinds of techniques to what we would use for mapping fire severity. We have to do it in a little bit of a different way, which I'm not going to get into too much. And we also have to figure out how to constrain the causal agents. So that's where aerial detection survey data comes in really handy in this case. We can use that to limit the extent of the area that we're mapping using the satellite data. To say these places have been affected by mountain pine beetle, and this was not logging or this was not fire or some other factor, right? So in this project, what we produced is a map that looks like this. And this is the percent basal area loss due to bark beetle outbreaks since 1997 in different parts of the region. So in this case, yellow areas have a lot of survival, purple areas have a lot of loss. You can see some hot spots here, like in the San Juans in southwestern Colorado. That's a spruce beetle outbreak, as I mentioned previously. This is kind of a mix of mountain pine beetle down here, spruce beetle up into Wyoming. But a lot of these places have been actually affected at low to moderate severity, which for me as a person growing up in Colorado and having a lot of experience in the mountains, driving around, going skiing and seeing these things kind of unfold. I was surprised to see this actually. I was surprised that so many of these places were affected at a low to moderate severity and that we had so much survival across much of the landscape. This is an interesting contrast with fire, I think, where bark beetle outbreaks have actually been fairly extensive, right? They've affected a greater area than fire across the Western US and in the study area. But when they occur, they don't kill all the trees in the stand. That's very, very uncommon. What we see instead is that these patches of high severity effects where you're losing 90+% of the trees in the stands are about 1/40th the size of a stand replacing fire patch on average. Kind of wild, right? Yeah, so it's like dispersed, but not severe in any one place. And so this lends itself to different recovery dynamics as well. When you're not losing all the trees in any one place, a lot of the weight of recovery is put on the things that survive the event. And because bark beetles are host and size selective, that lends itself to some really interesting dynamics, right? Where the particular agent that came through and the effects on the stand are really contingent on what was there to begin with. So what we see is that in general in the subalpine, forest recovery is dependent on the things that were there to begin with. And that's an interesting difference, I think. So the goal of this study that I'm talking about here was to look at post-outbreak trajectories across much of this area. What species are coming in where, how much of those species are present in different places. These are kinds of the things that we were trying to get at with a little bit more precision here, whereas the previous map is just telling us kind of across all species how much basal area was lost. This study is trying to hone in on how much of individual species are present in different parts of the landscape. In the first element of this, we used about 1,000 field plots collected by a range of collaborators that we have of really good folks up in Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico. We used the field plots to look at differences from pre-outbreak to post-outbreak in stand conditions, so structure, composition, and then potential for recovery. This first one here, this is showing that outbreaks on average decrease the size of live trees as we kind of expected based on that photo that I showed you previously, as well as what we know about bark beetles in general. But what's interesting here is that those effects seem a lot more pronounced in spruce and pine than they do in the other species that are fairly widespread in this area as well. So in this graph, what you're seeing on the y-axis is the percentage of all trees in different bins in the diameter class. The black circles are the post-outbreak quadratic mean diameter for a species, and the empty circles are the pre-outbreak quadratic mean diameter. Thinking more about the compositional shifts, so this figure instead is showing the percentage of all plots dominated by a given species, pre-outbreak versus post-outbreak. The ribbons are showing the trajectories of individual plots. So if you see, for example, a light green ribbon that stays light green, that means that a site was dominated by England spruce and it remained England spruce after the outbreak. One thing that's really notable here, spruce and lodgepole pine dominated the vast majority of these plots before outbreak. Now we're seeing a much greater component of sub-alpine fir and a bit of an increase in aspen as well. But notably, as I mentioned previously, very, very few of these plots actually lost all the overstory trees. It's like 0.8% of the total showed an entire loss of the overstory. And for all those plots, there were juveniles present in the understory that just didn't get tallied in this survey. Expanding to a broader scale. So this is looking at kind of the broad scale patterns across the whole study area, different amounts of species in different places. This one on the left is showing live basal area of adult or mature trees. The one on the right is showing juvenile density of everything below breast height. And what you can see here, aspen has some places that it's really dominant in some areas. Spruce and pine are still remaining in some areas in the overstory. But what these juvenile densities point to is an increasing role of aspen and sub-alpine fir in many places following the outbreaks. These are the things that are going to come in and take over the overstory in a few years. And notably, sub-alpine fir seems to be showing a huge increase in the extent of dominance. So sub-alpine fir, I mentioned the study area, we're talking about an area of 145,000 square kilometers across the whole region, 55% of that's forested. 4,000 square kilometers are converting in dominance from one sub-alpine species to another in sub-alpine fir. And what this means in the long term actually is that sub-alpine fir is, we know, a much more drought sensitive species than these other conifers. Maybe not in comparison to aspen, but at least in comparison to like lodgepole pine and England spruce, it's fairly drought sensitive. And this might also kind of set us up for more outbreaks of the western balsam bark beetle in the future. So I'm really interested in the differences between these two different kinds of disturbances because they are so extensive, because they both affect such a huge forested area in western North America, but they act in such different ways, right? That to me has been one of the most eye-opening things of working on these two topics of the past few years, is just how different these things operate. And as I mentioned earlier, wildfire, it's maybe a little bit less extensive in its effects. It doesn't affect so much of an area of forests across the West. But where it does occur, it's more likely to drive conversion to non-forest than something like bark beetle outbreaks, which leave a lot of trees in their wake. We also see that following high severity fire, recovery of conifers is contingent on a lot of different things, but one of the most important is dispersal from live trees, right? When we talk about bark beetle outbreaks, juveniles are almost always unaffected by bark beetles. So, and in sub-alpine, there are a lot of juveniles in the understory. It's like sometimes they're like wading through them to get from one place to another. So that's a key difference. Overall, climate change is expected to alter both the distribution of forests and the extent of disturbances, and in some cases, the severity of disturbances. All of these things will be key mechanisms in driving changes in the extent of these ecosystems. But one key point is that recovery following these two different types of disturbance will occur very differently, which makes it fairly complicated to project future change. So I think we have a few minutes for questions. Anybody in the room or on Zoom? Okay.
Sub-Alpine forests are less drought resistant. The area is going to get drier and warmer. That doesn't bode well for that forest to right?
Right, yeah, that's one of the things that we're a little bit concerned about with this study. It's sort of indicating this increasing role of the species that is pretty sensitive to drought. And previous studies have shown that pretty effectively in looking at like past mortality as a response to climate, right? These dry years tend to trigger greater increases in mortality of subalpine fir than these other species. But that being said, it's also fairly short-lived, and it doesn't mean that those other species are gone from the landscape. So those other species could come in and dominate again. Definitely possible. Yeah.
So much for your presentation.
Yeah.
Please, can you give me a link to the sustainability goals?
What was the last thing you said?
Sustainable development goals. Can you link to your link to the sustainable development goals of the United Nations?
Oh man, yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, I think I would like to hear other folks' input on that. To be honest, I think one key thing that I think about a lot is this issue of carbon sequestration, kind of broadly, if we're talking about like RED programs, right? Carbon sequestration is, or sort of the live above ground biomass of forests is overwhelmingly dominated by large trees. And if you're seeing a death of a lot of large trees on the landscape, you know, that means that a lot of live above ground biomass is no longer a carbon sink, right? So it does kind of affect the dynamics of those systems a little bit, the carbon budget of those systems a bit. That effect has been thought to be fairly short-lived, like, you know, within about 10 years, stands start sequestering carbon at the rate that they did before the outbreak, but it takes a little bit. So it's probably not a real long-term effect. But in terms of the fire stuff, you know, I think that's a much clearer-cut story. That if we're seeing high severity fire paired with drought, just means probably a lower extent of forests in the future. And that has a lot of implications on both kind of a west-wide scale, but also an international scale. Does that get at your question at all? Yeah.
Observation.
Yeah.
I think it's good news that you guys are getting more aspen because we're losing them. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. Connor and I were just talking about that actually, because a lot of his PhD is on aspen. And, you know, I think it's interesting because we're seeing a lot of juveniles. Studies have kind of suggested that a lot of ungulates, like high ungulate populations, either post-bark beetle or just in general, because of the way it's managed, those populations are managed, could restrict recruitment, keep those juveniles from becoming like mature trees in the overstory. Similarly, drought, oyster shell scale, these are all different things that can affect aspen in the Southern Rockies as well. But I think there is some good news for aspen, for sure. I mean, it seems to be doing well in some places.
I guess that just sparked a thought. Like I know over like the Wallow fire they saw a lot of aspen generating,
Yeah.
and eventually the conifers came back. So it'll be interesting long term if you guys will see that pattern as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised actually. I think that's Bill Rami's done some kind of related work mapping the extent of he called it persistent aspen versus sterile aspen in Western Colorado, and there's a little bit of both in different places. So some of these places certainly could come back to like subalpine fir or spruce, like some of these species that can tolerate shade pretty well in the understory of aspen. Whereas aspen's unlikely to sort of keep going once it takes a foothold in the overstory. Yeah, so I wouldn't be surprised to see that.
Sam has a question in chat. Can you elaborate on the spectral indices or methods you used in the Landsat time series analysis?
Yeah.
Is it similar to NDVI change?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Ndvi was one of the things that we looked at. We were using a bunch of different spectral indices that were indicative of changes in vegetation. So Ndvi is kind of the classic example of that, where you're looking at the difference between your infrared and red bands in the electromagnetic spectrum. But there are a bunch of different places that we can actually take slices of the curves of vegetation. So we actually used about 15 different spectral bands. What we found was the most informative was shortwave infrared, which is indicative of kind of moisture stress of vegetation. So bands 5 and 7 in the original Landsat 5, as well as the normalized burn ratio, which uses some of those bands. Those tended to be pretty good predictors of mortality in bark beetle outbreaks. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation.
Yeah.
It's really informative. I was just thinking about historic fire regime. We always talk about how they've been modified by humans, especially, etc. What about insect outbreak?
Yeah.
Have we modified that?
Yeah, I think that's kind of an area of debate. And it's challenging, right? Because in the Sub-Alpine, we know that there's been pretty extensive mining and logging in some of these areas. And those would have preferentially taken out a lot of the large trees in the 1800s. There was also actually a lot of intentional burning related to those things that led to increases in tree establishment in the 1800s. So we have kind of an influx of a lot of large trees today that were initiated in the 1800s. That makes sense. So that's one potential mechanism that people might have kind of increased the susceptibility to bark beetles at a really broad scale by just cutting all the big trees in the 1800s or burning forests. And in a broad scale, like there have been some studies that looked at this across the Western US, most of the trees have established since about 1850. If you look at kind of the extent of Western US forests. So it's about 100 to 150 years that trees start becoming really susceptible to bark beetles. So yeah, it's really a combination of like broadly suitable habitat plus pretty extreme drought in the early 2000s that initiated those things and let them get going. Yeah. Aaron?
So what are your recommendations for the science?
For future research. Yeah. No, that's a good question. I think we've done on these studies, we've done a fair bit of empirical work. I think others have done some really excellent empirical work as well on these topics. Modeling is kind of the key next step. We have a lot of data that's out there. But integrating that in a modeling framework and using that to project forest processes and forest dynamics into the future, I think that's the logical next step. Something that Pete and others are working on pretty extensively, these like forest landscape models and using them to try to project forest processes and future dynamics. That's the kind of thing that I think is kind of the key next step in these studies.
The policymakers, like if I'm the owner of the forest, or the manager of the forest, so what's the message to me?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, when we delve into it, there are a lot of different ways that this science can inform management. One of the key ones that comes to mind for the bark beetle stuff is lynx reintroduction. So folks may be familiar with lynx habitat in southern Colorado. Lynx has been reintroduced in a bunch of places. A couple studies have actually shown that lynx preferentially hang out in places with a lot of bark beetle mortality. Weirdly enough, when there's a lot of dead and down trees and a lot of standing dead trees, lynx tend to like those habitats. Probably because snowshoe hares are hanging out in those areas, their preferred food source. So when we think about forest management in those areas, things like sanitation, cutting, salvage logging, those sorts of things that are removing the down and dead or the standing dead, that might actually be detrimental to habitat in some ways. So that's one piece that comes to mind. I talked about the carbon sequestration stuff a while back. We don't think that, at least in the Sub-Alpine, it's having a huge impact on flammability necessarily. The death of trees isn't necessarily affecting flammability in these high elevation systems, because they only burn every 300 to 500 years under really, really extreme weather. fuels don't seem to matter a whole heck of a lot in those conditions. So, you know, in general, I'm kind of hands-off management and Sub-Alpine makes a lot of sense. Hands-on management in the Montane makes a lot more sense. Yeah, Aaron?
That kind of leads into my question. You talked about the effect of bark beetle, the effect of fire. I'm wondering if you've done any work or plan to do any work or know of any work that looks at kind of both of them together.
Yeah.
Like maybe if the bark beetle increases the chance of isolated fire.
Yeah, you know, there's sort of mixed science on that. I think in the Sub-Alpine, what people see in general is that bark beetle doesn't seem to affect high severity fire or flammability a whole heck of a lot. There have been a couple studies in like mixed conifer systems in California by Scott Stevens' lab that showed that it alters fuel complexes and maybe makes things a bit more flammable. So that's good information that these effects can actually be variable across an elevational gradient or different forest types. But they actually do have pretty interesting compounded effects. So there's been some research in the San Juans in particular in southwestern Colorado that showed that when you get an initial bark beetle outbreak that kills all the large live trees, those were the primary seed source, right? So then if you get a fire that comes through, even the places that were unburned no longer provide seed to the burned area. So that's a pretty clear compounded effect. Or if you get like a severe bark beetle outbreak followed by wildfire in a place that's dominated by non-serotinous species, it could have a pretty clear compounded effect. Yeah, but I'd be curious. I mean, are you thinking about other things on that topic?
I didn't really have a specific question. I just wanted to know what other information there
Yeah.
was for the two combined.
Yeah, no, and there has been, like I said, a fair bit of work on those different topics because these two disturbances are so widespread, right? The thought is that they probably interact in some ways. There's also some pretty interesting kind of longer term research that shows that initial bark beetle outbreaks, you know, like in the 1940s, affect the extent of fire or bark beetle outbreaks in recent years. So there's probably some longer term impacts as well. And then I kind of alluded to like, if you get a bark beetle that comes in and converts a stand to dominance of another tree, it probably is going to make it more susceptible to an outbreak of the bark beetle targeting that species in a few decades. So yeah, lots of different potential linked or compounded effects there. Yeah.
Are you working on any local carbon sequestration projects?
Yeah, nothing specific to carbon sequestration per se, but we've done since I started with ERI a few months ago, we work a lot on local Arizona, New Mexico kinds of projects. One of the things that we're starting to think about for the upcoming year is looking at how forest thinning might affect drought sensitivity of the remaining trees, kind of similar to stuff that he's been working on in previous years, but across a lot of sites in Arizona. So if you go out and cut some of the trees, does that make the site a little bit better in terms of carbon, sort of a long-term carbon sink? I'd also like to start getting into these landscape simulation models and using those as a similar tool. But yeah, a lot of that stuff is still kind of in the works. So didn't talk about it too much today. Good question though. Yeah.
Are there any concerns that like treatments to reduce catastrophic wildfire risk could lead to increased outbreaks of beetles because you're kind of preferentially leaving larger trees? Or is that not as much of a problem because a lot of those trees are right out in more areas, whereas the beetles are more of an issue in Sub-Alpine areas?
Yeah, you know, in the Southern Rockies, beetles have been mostly active in the Sub-Alpine, but that's not to say that's the case everywhere. Like in California, Western pine beetle has actually been pretty extensive in Ponderosa Pine, for example. So if you're going out and you're selectively harvesting a lot of the shade tolerant individuals and less fire tolerant individuals, and you're leaving a lot of large trees, yeah, certainly that could be an after effect. But I will say, stand density is also a strong predictor of bark beetle outbreaks, right? So when you have really dense stands with high basal area, that also makes them a bit more susceptible. So, like potentially offsetting effects there in some ways, I think. Yeah.
us on Zoom.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you again, everybody, for joining today. This was exciting thing to be a part of. It was really fun to be invited and be able to give a talk here in the seminar. And good to see everybody in person too. This is like kind of a weird shock given all the work from home and working in my closed office all the time. So if folks have other questions, I'll be in my office tomorrow actually. So swing by. I'm in room 207. And for folks at home, shoot me an email or something like that. Yeah.
Those in the seminar class